Our Time for All Ages is about an important figure in UU history, Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker was a Unitarian minister who was born in 1810, and he lived until 1860. And in his autobiography, he relates that as a child of about 4 or 5 years old, so not very tall, not even as tall as this pulpit here, he was living on a farm in Roxbury, which is outside of Boston, Massachusetts. He was walking through the fields in summertime on a day that was probably about as opposite from today as you can imagine. And he was swinging a stick around because that's what little boys probably liked to do then as now, and thwacking at the grass, enjoying the breezes. He came up to a little brook, and he spent some time kind of watching the water ripple on the brook, and then he noticed a little turtle. I like to imagine this turtle was no bigger than maybe the size of his hand, which was very small because he was still a very small boy. And he remembered seeing the older boys take their sticks, and as people did back then before they started to think so much of what animals meant and that animals had their own thoughts and feelings and spirits, he'd seen the older boys taking their sticks and thwacking the animals. So he raised his stick and he was going to bring it down on this tiny, defenseless turtle when something inside him held him back and stilled his arm, and he didn't hit the turtle. He walked home, and he was still thinking about this when he got home to his mother. And he told his mother what had happened and how mysterious he thought it was that he'd had this feeling that he shouldn't do what folks around him so often did. His mother listened to him carefully, and she said, "Theodore, that force inside you was the voice of conscience. Always pay attention to it. Always follow what your conscience tells you. It's a moral compass inside you that points you in the right direction. And if you honor your conscience, you won't go wrong in this world." Theodore Parker grew up to be a Unitarian minister, in fact, one of the greatest that our faith has ever known. He was a champion of the defenseless and very, very much a hero in the fight to end slavery in our country. He prayed to Father God and Mother God, which was a very unusual thing in his day, and he fought for women's equality and their right to vote. He always felt this sense of communion and commitment with the whole of creation. And it all started one summer day when he saw that small little turtle and decided to do what was right. We'll hear a little bit more about Theodore Parker in a few minutes. But for now, I wanted to share that one story of Theodore Parker as a small boy.
This morning we have 3 related readings. Our first comes from the 19th century Unitarian minister and abolitionist Theodore Parker that we just heard about. And he said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve or complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I'm sure it bends toward justice." Our second brief reading is from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s more familiar phrasing of Parker's words. "We shall overcome, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And our final statement of this idea comes from the former President Barack Obama, who reputedly appreciated this quote so much, he made it into a rug used in the Oval Office. And he said, "Progress is bumpy. It always has been. But because of dreamers and innovators, strivers and activists, progress has been this nation's hallmark." I'm fond of quoting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." I believe that. And I also believe that the arc of our nation, the arc of our world, does not bend toward justice or freedom or equality or prosperity on its own. It depends on us, on the choices we make, particularly at certain inflection points in history, particularly when big changes are happening and everything seems up for grabs.
Did something fall? Oh, okay. Thank you. What was that? Thank you for the beautiful rendition of those statements, Emmy. I appreciate it. I don't know about you, but I've been having some trouble trusting the moral arc of the universe these days. I really don't know which way it's bending most of the time. Theodore Parker may have felt this way when he first penned the words that became Martin Luther King Jr.'s well-known quote in our readings. And because Theodore Parker has become such a well-known person in our movement as a UU prophet of justice, I wanted to start by sharing a bit more about Parker's life than could be covered in our earlier illuminating anecdote about the turtle. Parker achieved notoriety as a minister in the Unitarian side of our denomination, first for his transcendentalist views alongside thinkers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. At first, this notoriety remained primarily about ecclesiastical matters. Denying biblical miracles was one of them, and affirming that God was immanent in human life. That was no small matter back then in what was still a very liberal and Christian religious movement. Other ministers started to refuse to exchange pulpits with Theodore Parker, meaning they wouldn't let him do what I'm doing today, come to speak at the pulpit of a neighboring church, because they so vehemently disagreed with what he was preaching. However, there were many who did support Parker, and in 1845, his supporters helped him establish the 28th Congregational Society of Boston. That tells you how many churches there were in Boston at the time that were congregational. And that organization, that congregation, attracted almost 1,000 people on Sunday mornings when Parker was preaching. Often other abolitionist figures would come to Boston to preach as well, but his sermons were some of the most popular and well-attended. In fact, by 1852, he was attracting so many people, up to 2,000, that they had to move to a new space, the Boston Music Hall, which would accommodate those large numbers, where he would speak particularly on topics related to abolition and the anti-slavery movement. He's well known for opposing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which created a federal mandate to recapture enslaved persons who had escaped to the free states in the North. And according to the Dictionary of UU Biography, which is a very helpful online resource, most of the other Unitarian ministers in Boston did not oppose this particular piece of legislation. They were not as progressive as Parker was. And in fact, many of the other ministers in Boston publicly supported the Fugitive Slave Act in order to preserve the Union. However, Parker was vehement in his disagreement with this act. In 1850, a woman in his congregation was herself a fugitive, Ellen Craft, and he hid her in his own home. In 1854, he was indicted by a grand jury for his actions on behalf of another fugitive, Anthony Burns. And later in the decade, as the Union came even closer to civil war, he was a member of the secret group who financially supported John Brown in his effort to start a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. This may give some context for the story that maybe you've heard, that Theodore Parker was the minister who kept a pistol by his desk while writing his sermons in case anyone came to threaten a runaway fugitive. And whether or not this is true, I think it's safe to say that he is a man who combined his words with his actions. Which brings me back to the now famous quote about the moral arc. Parker delivered the sermon from which our reading came in 1852 in an address called Of Justice and the Conscience. The sermon dealt at length with establishing just what he meant by the moral universe and how it related to justice in our world. In reading the full version of the sermon, which I realize would have taken well over an hour to deliver, it was that long, I was surprised by the lines which immediately followed these words about the arc of the moral universe. He said right after this passage that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, he said, "Things refused to be mismanaged long. Jefferson trembled when he thought of slavery and remembered that God is just. Ere long, America will tremble." The words made me pause because America is trembling now, still. Once a couple of years ago, I was walking a labyrinth behind a church in Deerfield, Illinois, and I promise this will come together and connect. The labyrinth's path was marked by stone in a gravel space behind the parking lot and next to a municipal park. It's actually the image on the slide right here. That's the actual labyrinth at this other church in Deerfield. It had been designed along the plan of the labyrinth at the cathedral in Chartres, France, and if you picked up one of these slips from the ushers, you'll see what the pattern of this labyrinth is. I entered the labyrinth with a question I wanted to consider, but my attention was soon caught by the way the pattern of the labyrinth twisted and turned. If you've ever traveled in a labyrinth, you'll know that it's a little bit different than a maze. There's only one way through a labyrinth, just like a maze, but you can't get lost. You can only lead from one point to the other. There are no false directions, no dead ends, or wrong ways. It only leads towards that center. And the only way to return and exit the labyrinth is to go back out the way you started. In all versions of the labyrinth that are meant for contemplation, the path winds and turns. You'll quickly find that you might be walking right next to the central circle, and then it turns, and you're on the outermost ring again. At times, you're so far away that it seems like you can't get any farther from the center, and yet, inexorably, the path takes you back towards the center again. It takes a relatively long time to move through a full labyrinth, and during our meditation, we're going to have some time to trace the labyrinth on the sheet of paper with your finger, if you so choose. Even just a few summers ago, I tried to walk a labyrinth that is underneath the Space Needle in Seattle. There's a wonderful playground there, and as part of the playground, there's a labyrinth that has been laid into or painted on the floor. And my children, who are a teen and a tween, they still got bored and they wanted to hop the lines and run to the center of the labyrinth. They wanted to make the progress more quick. It's tempting to do that, to do what they started to do, to cross the lines of rock or paint and jump to the next ring to make the process go faster. But eventually, if you do follow that path and round that final corner, you find you're in the center. After all that weaving in and out and back and forth, it's disorienting to suddenly find yourself with nowhere left to go, only that last central circle to pause in. I think of the center of the labyrinth as its heart, the space where you hope to find some answer to the question that you brought in with you. Will there be a way out of this mess we're in? Can I trust that the arc of the moral universe is bending towards justice? What am I to do if that trust is eroding? What if it seems, as it so often has over the past few weeks, that there are more twists and turns than answers or progress? When I think of the arc of the moral universe, it's that outermost ring of a labyrinth that I think of, the one when you're farthest from the center goal, the curve that takes the longest to traverse. After so much back and forth, moving along that outer arc can feel like moving in a straight line, like you're going nowhere and like the road isn't bending as it should. And because sometimes the path is twisting and turning so much, you don't always know how far off that next curve might be, and it feels like it takes forever to get to that next arc, to that curve. If we take the twists and turns of the labyrinth as a metaphor for the bending of the arc of the moral universe, I think it's fair to ask, can we trust that bending? Can we trust it even when the furthest loop is so long and the goal feels so far away? Can we trust it when we are caught in a bend in the road that surely feels to be headed in the wrong direction? Theodore Parker seemed to think that we could trust the arc in its bending, and he too faced a world where the goal seemed far enough away to feel far-fetched. The justice-filled world that Parker divined by conscience, excuse me, the justice-filled world that Parker divined by conscience looked a lot like a goal that we would recognize, and it faced familiar obstacles. In describing his own present moment, Parker used other resonant words in the same sermon from which I've been quoting. The leaders of modern civilization have scorned justice. The chiefs of war, of industry, and the church are joined in a solidarity of contempt. In America, not harlots, so much as statesmen, debauch the land. I'll let that one sit with you for a moment. By contrast, he held up a vision of a world centered on justice, saying, "It is justice that we want to organize, justice for all, for rich and for poor. There the slave shall be free from his master. There shall be no want, no oppression, no fear of man, no fear of God, but only love." And Parker believed, he trusted, that we did not need to see where the arc of the moral universe was going. "My eye reaches but a little ways," he said in the original quote. "I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience." He trusted that by conscience he could hold fast to this vision of a world moved by love and justice. Today we ask, what is this trust made of? Was it simply a blind faith? He had no evidence, no way to calculate the presence of justice by what he could see going on in his world at the time. And in fact, Parker did not expect that a God would take care of justice on God's own terms or by the divinity's own self, which is what this quote is sometimes critiqued as implying, that the long arc of the moral universe will eventually just get there and just get to a more just world on its own with no help from humans. That's not the case at all. That's not what he meant. At the very end of his very long sermon, well over 4 times probably as long as this one will be according to the internet's calculation of how long it takes to read certain numbers of words, he ended with a ringing statement. "In human affairs, the justice of God must work by human means. Men are the measure of God's principles, our morality the instrument of this justice. You and I can help move that work forward." Former President Barack Obama agreed. And he did, in fact, have that saying in a rug in his version of the Oval Office, along with some other powerful quotes. Obama agreed, noting that the arc of the moral universe is long, but he also believed that the arc of our nation, and I'm quoting here, the arc of our world, does not bend towards justice or freedom or equality or prosperity on its own. It depends on us, on the choices that we make, end quote. So how again does this relate to the labyrinth, that path where we cannot choose where to go, only to go forward, to reach the center and then move back out again? One answer comes from the Jewish sage Rabbi Tarfon from over 2,000 years ago, who taught that it is not incumbent on you to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. In the labyrinth, you must keep the path moving along. You must keep moving along the path, even when it feels like the path is moving backwards because the direction has twisted back yet again. So the question I'd like to leave you with is, what keeps you moving along the path? Your answer might be different from mine or from someone else's, but like any good compass, it points to what you trust to hold you on the path. Is it conscious, like it was for Theodore Parker? Perhaps it's our core Unitarian Universalist values that serve as a guiding moral compass, moving you towards the goal. Values that cannot be reached by shortcut or by jumping over the lines or skipping the hard steps needed to bring justice to our world. Perhaps it's the company of fellow travelers, others who can help along the journey of bending the arc. Moving through the labyrinth is so often a solitary activity, but I think we need to walk this particular labyrinth together. We need companions on this journey, fellow travelers and spiritual companions who can remind each other that the arc of the moral universe is a long one, but it bends towards justice. That companionship is one more thing that I can place my trust in. Let us each be those companions for each other on this journey. Thank you.